Surface water pollution. We're going to talk about pollution and the different sources of pollution and a little bit about remediation today. We can take pollution and split it into two groups. It's either going to be point source pollution or non-point source pollution. Point source pollution means that we can pinpoint where it's coming from. That pipe, that person, that truck, that building. So we would be able to figure out the source by like the location it's coming from. A non-point source pollutant or pollution is a little bit more it's harder to pinpoint the source. It could be a whole town. It could be just farming and agriculture in a community in a watershed. So it's a little bit more of a diffuse source, harder to pinpoint the location. Urban runoff and farm pesticides, insecticides, fertilizer are examples of non-point source pollution. The Clean Water Act was born the same year I was, and it was put in place to protect mostly rivers, but included other surface waters, smaller streams, lakes, wetlands. It did not protect, at that time in 1972, groundwater. It was just surface water. Then it was kind of vague with respect to what size of the bodies of water it protected. So the legislature makes the Clean Water Act. Then the judicial branch of the government had to interpret that and make some conclusions, and that didn't always go so well. The Clean Water Act said that it was going to make all U.S. surface waters fishable and swimmable by 1983. Achieve zero discharge of point source pollutants into surface water by 1995. Let's see, half of U.S. streams and a third of lakes and ponds and 2/3 of bays and estuaries are clean at this point. So it didn't really do exactly what they said it was going to do, but it's a really good start. So before the Clean Water Act in 1972, I'm going to turn my face off here. Before the Clean Water Act, the streams were polluted so much that they could catch on fire. The most famous or infamous one would be the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, and it would literally catch on fire. The surface would, because of pollutants that were floating on the surface. The world was polluted with DDT. There's a book, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that talks about the effect of DDT on birds and mostly on the viability of the embryos and the eggs, because the eggs would fall apart, and other pesticides. We don't use DDT anymore. There was raw sewage, just literally poop, being pumped into streams and out onto beaches. It was pretty disgusting. The Clean Water Act and then all the amendments added on it in the 80s were mostly controlling those point source pollutions. In order to do point source polluting, you have to have a permit. And the permits, that you can still do this. And basically it allows for pollution within certain limits. So limits that would not totally degrade the ecosystem, but that you can pollute some these days. There were, along with the Clean Water Act, major improvements with wastewater treatment, major improvements with stormwater, sewer runoff and controlling that, and then major redesigns of landfills. We basically went from open landfills to sanitary landfills where trash is now covered over top with soil and planted with grass, and then the base of it, there's some liner that catches the leachate running through the trash in the landfill. Non-point source is way more difficult to deal with. We can look at it different ways. There's eroding stream banks. So in that way, soil is the pollution. So soil is suspended in the water of a river is not a good thing. And so eroding stream banks, runoff from farms, animal feedlots are really gross. There's lots of poop and mud, and medicines, mines, construction sites. Your backyard could be a non-point source if you're in a neighborhood and everybody's fertilizing their lawns. Streets, parking lots. Some neighborhoods even still have individual septic systems in your yard, and so the neighborhood can be a point source. These are going to pollute surface waters, streams, rivers, lakes. Any surface water can get polluted by this non-point source. The examples of some of those pollutants are sediment, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, animal manure, oil, household chemicals. How do we manage then looking at pollution in surface waters? The best thing to do is think about it as individual watersheds, and what are the pressures on an individual watershed. Some watersheds have agriculture, some don't. Some have industry, some don't. Some have neighborhoods, some don't. So it's really individual watershed. Parameters will help you think about the best management practice for that watershed. And then in turn, you'll protect the streams, the ecosystems, and the groundwater supply. So preventing that soil erosion, reducing runoff from agricultural fields, urban areas, and construction sites. Runoff is a big deal. You got to contain that stuff. Limit the use of pesticides and fertilizers. This includes agriculture, from strawberries to GMO corn. Your lawn, golf courses, all have some kind of fertilizers or pesticides these days, unless they're obviously organically done. But even organic fertilizers is a fertilizer, right? So just containing the runoff is the important part there. Protect the wetlands and prohibit development on floodplains. So continuing to keep the health of the wetlands as an ecosystem and as a buffer against pollution is important. And then prohibiting the development on floodplains, whether it's just for safety or a land use management plan. All right, what do we do? Methods of these best management practices. One thing you can do, and this is becoming way more popular, is to put in a rain garden. These rain gardens are little low areas. They're usually low. Usually little. They are low, usually little, that are not a detention pond, but a retention pond. These are going to capture stormwater runoff, and they'll be on the edge of parking lots usually, or the edge of town, and they catch stormwater runoff from paved surfaces. When that catchment then, retention pond, not detention pond, allows, it catches the water and it allows for the slow introduction of the water into a stream channel. The opposite of that would be to allow for direct piping of stormwater runoff straight into a stream channel. So we see a lot of that around Boone and in Boone Creek. And the whole goal there is to mimic the pre-development conditions. Take urbanization and roll it back. Say, okay, if urbanization wasn't a thing in this location, what would the hydrologic cycle look like? There would be precipitation and infiltration and then recharge of the stream. When you take stormwater and you pipe it directly into a stream, you're skipping that infiltration step. So let's try to mimic that by putting in these rain gardens and allowing for that water to percolate, penetrate, infiltrate down into the groundwater supply. All right, so you can step back and say, let's have better site design, reduce the amount of paving, really limit how much pavement there is, cluster development into little pods, and then that can allow for more green space. So this example here would be like a planned neighborhood where the houses are kind of clustered together, but then included in that neighborhood plan would be like a hiking trail and all of this green space. So that's a nice neighborhood plan that some people are doing these days. Minimize erosion from active construction sites, silt fences. You see construction sites in the permitting process, they have to add in that silt fence over time it usually gets knocked down and forgotten about. So not only putting them in, but also maintaining the integrity of those silt fences, settling basins where sediment can be collected, and then disturb the natural landscape less, leaving some of the big trees, right? So if you're going to build a house, you're looking at the landscape, don't just go in and cut all the trees down. Leave some big trees, let those stay. Those really act to make it look better as a natural landscape and also hold sediment in place. The last one here is a riparian buffer zone. That's the vegetated corridor next to a stream, and it is good for humans. It's good for the ecology. It's good for all the animals and bunnies and deer and birds. It absorbs nutrient runoff. So nutrients would be things like that act as fertilizers. Those can get trapped and used in the riparian buffer zone before they would be headed straight for the stream. So keeping that riparian buffer zone also adds to the stability and reduces erosion and provides hiding spots for the organisms in the area and also completes the food cycle. All right. So I said earlier that with the Clean Water Act, there's still some pollution that is allowed. And the EPA requires states to identify the polluted rivers. States then individually, they're supposed to govern the pollution in their states. The EPA just can't govern all of that and shouldn't really. So the states come up with a plan. The states set the limits. The states require anyone who is going to pollute the watershed to have a plan, and then also a monitoring system. Okay. So looking at the figure below, this is TDS, total dissolved solids, in ppm, which is parts per million. That means if there were 1 million molecules, how many of them would be dissolved solids? So across the top of this figure is kind of like a graph, 1 ppm up to 500 plus ppm. And over on the left then is the ideal drinking water. So this would be clean drinking water with no dissolved solids. Then we go over to the right, we get to an EPA maximum, 500 plus TDS for the dissolved solids. So in the middle is the marginally acceptable, and sometimes that's acceptable. Sometimes that will be the level that a state says, okay, you can have this marginally acceptable pollution amount, total dissolved solids, in the stream. Maybe as long as it's not used for drinking water. These days, there are new threats to drinking water, and you'll hear about these in the news. These become quite oddly political. Why is it political to try to protect the environment? I don't know. But here's two big ones. Mountaintop removal, and this is a very important conversation in Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and most of West Virginia. And this is the idea that you can take a mountain, and it has a seam of coal in it. We'll call my pinkies the coal. And in the olden days, they would dig down and get this seam of coal. Now they can just blast the mountain off, right? So flatten it, make it a plateau, and get the coal out pretty easily. The problem with that is all of this material up here has to go somewhere. So oftentimes it's put into streams. Just fill up the valley with that sediment. And this has been one of those problems with the Clean Water Act, and that what size stream is protected. So when you hear about legislation going back and forth with mountaintop removal, it's usually about that valley fill. Where can they put the mountain that they removed? Then you've got settling ponds that are these dirty ponds. They're big, they're full of sediment and exposed minerals that are becoming, the water becomes acidic. And so keeping those settling ponds and not having them, the dams need to be really well built, and they're up in the hollers all around these mountains. it's just a lot goes into making sure those are safe. The next one that's a newer surface water threat is you may hear it called fracking, and that's hydrofracturing. It's where the olden days you could drill straight down, and whatever oil or gas was free in the rocks down there, it would just come up through the pipe. Well, these days we can now turn that drill and amazingly go sideways. And that's opened up a whole new amount of natural gas in the United States, in Canada, and around the world. When they drill sideways, then they're in this rock type called shale, and shale is what we call tight. It doesn't have a lot of permeability to it. So they will, once they've drilled sideways, they'll blast the rock with high pressure water and chemicals, and that releases that natural gas can flow. It has really opened up a lot of new resources all across the United States, economic booms all over the place. But the negative effect can be if that water that's blasting there gets into a drinking water supply. So disposing that wastewater has become a concern, because it's basically polluted water. It's dirty water. Can also pick up radioactive ions when it's down there doing that fracturing, and then spills at the site. So the site where the platform, essentially the drilling platform, has to be really well maintained. Okay. Here's what mountaintop removal looks like, and this is the ugly part of it. So we've removed the mountain, and now that fill that was that mountain is now going to be put down into the valleys. They filled in 200 miles of headwater stream valleys so far in the southwestern United States. Here's an image of hydrofracturing. Okay, let me turn my face off again, get it out of the way. Here's the drill site and the drilling. Again, here it goes sideways, and then they high pressure hot water blasts these cracks into the shaly unit here, and that's going to release that natural gas. High pressure fracturing fluid opens networks of fractures in the shale. That fluid is going to have mixed in with it sand, and the sand is going to fill in those little cracks and keep them open. Glass flows from the fractures into the pipe. Yep. So you can look at that and see there are different possible pathways for pollution from fracturing.